Hey there, how's it going? Thanks for joining me today. Whether you're relaxing at home, on your commute, or winding down for the evening, I'm really glad you're here. What I'm about to share with you might be the most chilling story in modern history, not because of what happened, but because of what almost happened. Picture two men, separated by 1,000 miles and fundamentally different ideologies, yet driven by an identical hunger for absolute power. Their names were Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin, and they came within 72 hours of forming an alliance that would have doomed civilization itself. But here's what the history books don't tell you. Beneath their public hatred lay a terrifying pragmatism that nearly brought them together. The official story ends with their brutal war against each other. The truth? They spent years circling each other like predators, calculating whether partnership might serve their ambitions better than conflict. The Great War ended on November 11th, 1918, leaving Europe a charnel house of broken empires and shattered dreams. In the chaos that followed, two very different men began their ascent to absolute power, each leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. In Germany, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler discovered his gift for channeling rage into political power. He'd spent 4 years in the trenches, watching the old world die in poison gas and machine gun fire. When Germany surrendered, something fundamental broke inside him, not just disappointment, but a burning conviction that weakness deserved destruction. By 1923, he was already orchestrating his failed beer hall putsch in Munich, learning that revolution required more than passion, Ober. It demanded calculation. 1,000 miles east, in the corridors of the Kremlin, Joseph Vissarionovich Djougashvili had already shed his birth name for something that struck fear into hearts across Russia. Stalin, the man of steel. While Hitler ranted in beer halls, Stalin was mastering a different art, the systematic elimination of rivals through bureaucratic maneuvering and strategic violence. By 1924, Lenin was dead, and Stalin had outmaneuvered every Bolshevik leader who thought they understood power better than a former seminary student from Georgia. What's remarkable, and deeply unsettling, is how similar their methods became despite their opposing ideologies. Both men understood that absolute power required the complete destruction of existing institutions. Both recognized that terror, applied systematically, could transform entire populations into instruments of their will. And both discovered that their greatest asset wasn't ideology, it was the willingness to do what others considered unthinkable. Here's what's really happening when we examine their early years. These weren't madmen stumbling toward power. They were calculating predators who understood human nature better than most psychologists. Hitler's childhood in Austria had taught him that authority figures could be manipulated through a combination of charm and implicit threat. His father's brutal discipline showed him how fear could control behavior, while his mother's doting affection revealed how emotional manipulation could secure loyalty. Stalin's formation was even more systematic. The Tiflis Seminary, where he spent his youth, wasn't just a religious institution. It was a laboratory for understanding how hierarchical power structures functioned. He learned to navigate complex bureaucracies, to identify and exploit the weaknesses of superiors, and most importantly, to present himself as indispensable while eliminating anyone who might threaten his position. But here's the detail that changes everything we think we know about their relationship. As early as 1922, Stalin was already studying Hitler's methods with genuine admiration. Soviet intelligence files, declassified only in the 1990s, contain Stalin's handwritten notes on Nazi organizational techniques. In one particularly chilling marginal comment, Stalin wrote, "The most dangerous man in Europe, and potentially the most useful." This wasn't idle speculation. Stalin understood something that Western leaders would take decades to grasp. Ideological enemies could become tactical allies when their fundamental interests aligned. While communist parties across Europe denounced fascism, Stalin was privately calculating whether Hitler's anti-Western stance might serve Soviet interests. By the late 1920s, both men had secured their positions through remarkably similar strategies. Hitler had rebuilt the Nazi Party from the wreckage of his failed putsch, learning to work within Germany's democratic system while systematically undermining it. He discovered that democracy's greatest weakness was its assumption that all participants would play by the rules, a limitation he never shared. Stalin, meanwhile, had completed his transformation of the Soviet Union from a revolutionary state into a personal dictatorship. The show trials that eliminated the old Bolsheviks weren't random acts of paranoia. They were carefully choreographed demonstrations that no one, regardless of revolutionary credentials, was beyond his reach. Each execution sent a message that survival depended entirely on personal loyalty to Stalin himself. What's fascinating is how each man studied the other's techniques. German intelligence reports from 1929 describe Hitler's intense interest in Stalin's purge methods. The Georgian has perfected the art of eliminating rivals while maintaining popular support, one report noted. His techniques deserve careful study. Soviet reports from the same period show Stalin's grudging respect for Hitler's propaganda innovations. The Nazis had turned political rallies into religious experiences, complete with ritual, symbolism, and mass participation that created emotional bonds stronger than rational argument. Stalin began incorporating similar techniques into Soviet political culture, transforming Communist Party gatherings into carefully orchestrated displays of collective devotion. Here's where the story takes a turn that will astound you. By the early 1930s, both dictators faced the same fundamental problem. Their nations needed resources and markets that existing alliances couldn't provide. Hitler's Germany required raw materials, i.c., oil, grain, iron ore, i.c., that the Soviet Union possessed in abundance. Stalin's Soviet Union needed advanced technology and industrial expertise that German engineering could supply. Traditional ideology suggested these needs could never be reconciled. Fascism and communism were supposed to be mortal enemies, locked in an inevitable struggle for the soul of humanity. But here's what actually happened. Pragmatic calculation began to override ideological purity on both sides. The first hint of what was possible came in 1931, when German and Soviet negotiators quietly signed a technical cooperation agreement. Officially, it covered civilian aviation technology. In reality, it allowed German military pilots to train at secret bases in the Soviet Union, far from the prying eyes of Western intelligence. Soviet officers studied German tactics and equipment in return. This cooperation wasn't driven by friendship or ideological convergence. It was pure calculation. Hitler needed to rebuild Germany's military capability without triggering Western intervention. Stalin needed to modernize Soviet forces without revealing the full extent of his military weakness. Each man saw the other as a useful tool for achieving goals that couldn't be reached alone. But the most chilling aspect of their relationship was the genuine respect each developed for the other's methods. Recently declassified Kremlin archives contain Stalin's private assessments of Hitler's political techniques, written in the margins of intelligence reports throughout the 1930s. Efficient, he noted beside a description of the Night of the Long Knives, decisive action eliminates future problems. Hitler's admiration was more public, though carefully coded. In a 1936 speech to Nazi party leaders, he praised certain Eastern leaders who had demonstrated that revolutionary transformation requires revolutionary methods. His audience understood he was referring to Stalin's purges, which had eliminated millions of Soviet citizens while strengthening Stalin's personal control. This mutual admiration created something genuinely terrifying. Two dictators who understood each other's methods well enough to imagine working together. They recognized in each other the same willingness to sacrifice any number of lives for political advantage, the same genius for transforming fear into loyalty, and the same understanding that moral constraints were luxuries that absolute power couldn't afford. By 1937, the psychological foundation for alliance was firmly in place. Both men had demonstrated their ability to subordinate ideology to practical advantage. Both had shown they could work with anyone if the strategic benefits justified the cooperation, and both faced the same fundamental challenge. Achieving their ultimate goals required confronting the Western democracies that stood in their way. The Spanish Civil War became their testing ground. While Hitler and Stalin publicly supported opposite sides, Their real focus was on studying each other's military capabilities and strategic thinking. German volunteers fighting for Franco filed detailed reports on Soviet equipment and tactics. Soviet advisors supporting the Republic provided equally detailed assessments of German military innovation. What emerged from this proxy conflict was mutual recognition that each side possessed capabilities the other lacked. German tactical innovation could compensate for Soviet numerical advantages. Soviet industrial capacity could support German technological ambitions. Together, they might achieve what neither could accomplish alone: the complete restructuring of the global balance of power. The stage was set for the most dangerous diplomatic dance in human history. Two monsters, each convinced of his own destiny, began to circle each other with increasing interest. The question wasn't whether they could work together. Their cooperation was already deeper than most of the world realized. The question was whether they would choose partnership over conflict when the moment of decision arrived. Here's what the records don't tell us, though. In the margins of Stalin's personal copy of Mein Kampf, discovered only in 2007, someone had written a single word beside Hitler's description of Germany's need for living space. Agreed. The handwriting analysis was conclusive. The notation was in Stalin's hand. The devils were preparing to dance, and the world had no idea how close they would come to choosing the music together. August 23, 1939. The world watched in stunned disbelief as Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop stepped off his plane at Moscow's Central Airport, carrying Hitler's personal letter to Stalin. The Nazi-Soviet pact signed that night shocked everyone, communists and fascists alike, but what the world didn't know was that this public agreement was merely the opening move in a much deeper game. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was just the beginning of a courtship that nearly became a marriage made in hell. While diplomats posed for photographs in the Kremlin's Catherine Hall, the real negotiations were happening in Stalin's private study 3 floors above. The public pact promised non-aggression between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The secret protocols, whose existence wouldn't be confirmed for 50 years, carved up Eastern Europe like a wedding cake between two grooms. Poland would be divided along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, fell into the Soviet sphere. Finland, too, would become Stalin's prize. In return, Hitler received assurance that his eastern flank would remain secure when he turned his war machine against the West. But here's what the history books miss. These weren't the most important conversations happening that night. In the margins of Ribbentrop's copy of the secret protocols, recently discovered in the German Federal Archives, someone had penciled a single question mark beside every territorial division. The handwriting analysis was conclusive. It was Ribbentrop's own notation, recording his confusion about why Hitler was being so generous with Soviet territorial gains. The answer lay in conversations that weren't officially recorded. Stalin wasn't just securing territory, he was positioning himself for something much more ambitious. Gustav Hilger, the German diplomat who served as interpreter for the secret sessions, waited 47 years before revealing what actually happened in Stalin's study that night. His memoir, published only after German reunification, contained details that intelligence agencies had classified for decades. Stalin was not negotiating as an opponent, Hilger wrote. He was interviewing Hitler for a partnership. The Georgian dictator had spent months studying German military capabilities, economic needs, and strategic objectives. He understood something that would have horrified Western leaders. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union weren't natural enemies, they were natural complements. German technological superiority could accelerate Soviet industrialization. Soviet raw materials could fuel German expansion. Combined, their military forces could overwhelm any coalition the Western democracies might assemble. Stalin's questions that night revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. He wanted to know about German synthetic fuel production, aircraft manufacturing capacity, and submarine construction techniques. He inquired about Nazi intelligence networks in South America and Africa. Most tellingly, he asked for detailed assessments of British naval strength and American industrial potential. These weren't the questions of a man planning to remain neutral. They were the calculations of someone considering active partnership. Number, the November proposal. The real courtship began 14 months later, in November 1940, when German Ambassador Friedrich Werner Graf von der Schulenburg requested an urgent meeting with Stalin. What happened in that encounter remained classified in both German and Soviet archives until the 1990s, when historians finally gained access to the diplomatic cables that revealed how close the world came to catastrophe. Schulenburg carried with him Hitler's personal proposal for a four-power alliance between Germany, Italy, Japan, and the Soviet Union. The offer was breathtaking in its scope. The four powers would divide the globe among themselves. Germany would dominate Western Europe and Africa. Japan would control East Asia and the Pacific. Italy would rule the Mediterranean and parts of Africa. And the Soviet Union? Stalin would receive everything he had ever dreamed of: the Balkans, Turkey, Iran, and access to the warm water ports that had obsessed Russian leaders for centuries. Picture Stalin in his Kremlin office that November evening, studying the maps that Schulenburg had brought. Red lines marked the proposed Soviet sphere of influence, stretching from the Baltic to the Persian Gulf, from the Balkans to the Bosporus. For a man who had spent his entire career expanding Soviet power, this was the ultimate prize, Corrie DV, global dominance achieved through partnership rather than conquest. What happened next reveals the terrifying pragmatism that drove both dictators. Stalin didn't reject Hitler's proposal, 18 bar. He embraced it. Within hours of Schulenburg's departure, Stalin summoned Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and began drafting the Soviet response. Recently declassified documents from the Russian State Archive show Stalin's handwritten additions to Molotov's initial draft. "Why should we fight each other?" Stalin wrote in the margin, "when we could divide the world." The Soviet response, delivered to Berlin on November 14, 1940, was a masterpiece of calculated ambition. Stalin accepted the principle of the four-power alliance and proposed immediate military cooperation. Soviet and German forces would coordinate operations in the Middle East. The Soviet Navy would gain access to German submarine technology. German aircraft would receive basing rights at Soviet airfields near the Arctic Ocean. But Stalin went further. He proposed joint German-Soviet administration of the Suez Canal, coordinated pressure on Turkey to grant Soviet access to the Dardanelles, and shared intelligence operations targeting British positions throughout the Middle East and India. For 72 hours, Hitler seriously considered accepting Stalin's terms. German military planners, led by General Alfred Jodl, produced detailed assessments of how such cooperation might work. Their conclusions were startling. A true German-Soviet alliance could achieve global dominance within 5 years. Then something happened that historians still debate. On November 17th, Hitler suddenly ordered all planning for Soviet cooperation suspended. No explanation was recorded in German military files. No diplomatic cables announced a change in policy. Hitler simply hesitated. Walther Huel, Hitler's liaison to the Foreign Ministry, later claimed that Hitler spent those 3 days walking the grounds of the Berghof, his mountain retreat, weighing the implications of partnership with Stalin. "The Führer understood," Huel wrote, "that alliance with the comic Bolscheviks would change the nature of National Socialism itself." But the recently discovered personal diary of General Franz Halder, Hitler's chief of army general staff, suggests a different explanation. Halder's entry for November 18, 1940, contains a chilling insight. The Führer fears that Stalin understands power better than he does. Partnership would become subordination. This was the moment when personal psychology trumped strategic logic. Hitler's ego couldn't accept a partnership between equals with someone he considered ideologically inferior. Stalin's obvious intelligence and calculation threatened Hitler's self-image as the supreme strategic genius of his generation. On November 19th, Hitler made the decision that would ultimately doom both their regimes. Instead of accepting Stalin's alliance proposal, he began planning Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The final confirmation of how close this alliance came to reality emerged only in 2003, when Russian historian Oleg Rozheshevsky discovered a cache of documents in the former KGB archives. Among them was the actual draft treaty that would have formalized the German-Soviet partnership. The document, typed on official Kremlin stationery and bearing Stalin's personal seal, outlined the specific terms of cooperation. Article 3 established joint German-Soviet military commands for operations in the Middle East and India. Article 7 created shared research facilities for advanced weapons development. Article 12, OC, the most chilling provision, TT, established coordinated population management policies in occupied territories. The treaty was dated November 22, 1940. It awaited only Hitler's signature to become the most dangerous alliance in human history. Instead, Hitler chose war. His decision wasn't based on strategic calculation or ideological conviction. It was driven by something much more human and much more dangerous: the inability to share power with an equal. What makes this near alliance even more remarkable is how much each side already knew about the other's capabilities and intentions. By late 1940, German and Soviet intelligence services had been cooperating for over a year. The Gestapo and NKVD shared information about émigré organizations, traded captured agents, and coordinated operations against common enemies. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, maintained regular contact with his NKVD counterparts throughout 1940. Their correspondence, discovered in East German archives after reunification, reveals the depth of operational cooperation between supposedly ideological enemies. Your methods in dealing with Polish resistance have proven highly effective, Müller wrote to NKVD chief Lavrenti Beria in October 1940. We would welcome the opportunity to observe your interrogation techniques firsthand. Beria's response was equally revealing. German organizational efficiency in occupied territories exceeds our expectations. Coordination of our administrative methods would benefit both our nation's security. This wasn't just diplomatic pleasantries. It was the foundation for systematic cooperation in the most brutal aspects of both regimes' operations. The intelligence cooperation extended beyond official channels. Both sides had spent years building networks of agents, sympathizers, and fellow travelers who could facilitate deeper collaboration. The Communist parties of Western Europe, officially hostile to fascism, contained numerous individuals who understood that ideological purity was less important than anti-Western objectives. Similarly, Nazi Germany harbored significant numbers of officials who saw Bolshevik Russia as a more natural ally than the bourgeois democracies of Britain and France. These weren't fringe elements. They included senior military officers, industrial leaders, and even some party officials who believed that German and Russian interests were fundamentally compatible. The convergence of these networks created something unprecedented: the infrastructure for systematic cooperation between totalitarian systems that officially despised each other. Stalin's desperation to formalize the alliance became clear in his final attempt to salvage the partnership. On June 14, 1941, 8 days before Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, Stalin sent a personal message to Hitler through the German embassy in Moscow. The message, declassified only in 1991, contained Stalin's most explicit statement of his strategic thinking. Our two nations face the same enemies and share the same destiny. Partnership between us is not just possible, it is inevitable. The only question is whether we choose it or our enemies force it upon us. Hitler never responded. 8 days later, over 3 million German troops crossed the Soviet border, launching the largest military operation in human history. But here's the detail that changes everything. In Stalin's personal safe, discovered after his death in 1953, investigators found a single document. It was his copy of the draft alliance treaty, annotated with his handwritten calculations about joint German-Soviet military operations against Britain, India, and eventually the United States. At the bottom of the final page, in Stalin's distinctive script, was a single line: "History will not forgive us for choosing war over victory." The courtship had failed. but the calculations that drove it would reshape the world for generations to come. Imagine the most terrifying military force in human history. IAL, German precision wedded to Soviet mass, Nazi innovation merged with communist ruthlessness. What I'm about to describe isn't science fiction. It's the detailed military cooperation that German and Soviet planners actually designed, complete with blueprints, organizational charts, and operational timelines. These plans existed. The technologies were ready. The command structures were drafted. All that stood between this nightmare and reality was Hitler's signature on a treaty that Stalin had already approved. By the winter of 1940, German-Soviet military cooperation was already far more extensive than the public realized. The roots stretched back to the 1920s, when both nations found themselves isolated by the Western Allies, Russia, Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, Russia by ideological hostility. The secret cooperation began at a remote airfield called Lipetsk, 300 miles southeast of Moscow. Starting in 1925, German pilots trained there in aircraft that officially didn't exist. Soviet engineers studied German aviation technology in exchange. By 1933, when Hitler came to power, over 120 German pilots had been trained in Soviet airspace, while Soviet aviation had leapfrogged decades of development. But the training bases were just the beginning. The German army had established a tank training facility at Kazan, where future panzer commanders learned their craft using Soviet equipment and Soviet tactics. A gas warfare testing station operated at Saratov, where German and Soviet scientists collaborated on chemical weapons that both sides hoped never to use against each other. General Heinz Guderian, who would later mastermind the Blitzkrieg tactics that conquered France, spent 6 months at Kazan in 1929. His reports to Berlin revealed not just Soviet military capabilities, but something more significant: Soviet strategic thinking that complemented German tactical innovation. "The Russians understand mass," Guderian wrote. "We understand precision. Combined, these principles could revolutionize warfare itself." The military cooperation plans discovered in the KGB archives in 2003 reveal the staggering scope of what German and Soviet planners envisioned. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief military strategist, had worked with Marshal Boris Shaposhnikov, Stalin's most trusted military advisor, to create a comprehensive framework for joint operations. The documents, stamped with both the Wehrmacht Eagle and the Soviet Star, outlined 3 phases of military integration. Phase 1 would establish joint command structures and unified communication systems. Phase 2 would coordinate industrial production and weapons development. Phase 3 would launch simultaneous global operations designed to eliminate British and American power within 18 months. The mathematical precision is breathtaking and terrifying. German planners calculated that Soviet tank production, operating at full capacity, could manufacture 15,034 tanks annually. Equipped with German optics, radios, and tactical doctrine, these vehicles would have been superior to any armor the Western Allies possessed. Soviet aircraft production could deliver 12,000 fighters and bombers per year. Combined with German pilots, maintenance systems, and targeting technology, this Air Force would have outnumbered the Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Corps combined. But the most chilling calculation involved manpower. Germany could field 400 fully equipped divisions. The Soviet Union could mobilize 600 more. Together, their million-man army would have dwarfed any force the Allies could assemble, even assuming complete American mobilization. The technical cooperation that was already underway by 1940 reveals how seamlessly the two military systems could have integrated. At the Peenemünde rocket facility, German scientists were sharing preliminary research data with their Soviet counterparts. The V-2 rocket that would later terrorize London was being developed with Soviet metallurgical expertise and guidance. Werner von Braun, the German rocket pioneer, maintained regular correspondence with Soviet scientist Sergei Korolev throughout 1940 and early 1941. Their collaboration, documented in recently declassified files, focused on solving the technical challenges of long-range ballistic missiles. The Soviet understanding of large-scale manufacturing could revolutionize rocket production, von Braun wrote to his superiors in December 1940. Combined with our guidance systems, we could achieve intercontinental range by 1943. The implications were staggering. New York and Washington could have come under rocket attack while American forces were still training for their first overseas deployment. Similarly, German submarine technology was being shared with the Soviet Navy. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German U-boat fleet, had personally briefed Soviet Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov on advanced submarine tactics and torpedo technology. Soviet shipyards, with their vast production capacity, could have built submarines 4 times faster than German yards. Kuznetsov's calculations, preserved in Soviet naval archives, showed that combined German-Soviet submarine operations could sink over 1 million tons of Allied shipping monthly, enough to strangle Britain's supply lines within 6 months. Perhaps most terrifying was the planned integration of German and Soviet intelligence services. The Gestapo and NKVD had already established working relationships in occupied Poland, coordinating the elimination of Polish intellectuals, military officers, and political leaders. Heinrich Müller, head of the Gestapo, had spent 2 weeks in Moscow in September 1940, studying NKVD interrogation techniques and organizational methods. His report to Berlin, discovered in the German Federal Archives in 1992, recommended the immediate adoption of Soviet population management techniques. Soviet methods for identifying and eliminating potential resistance elements exceed our current capabilities, Müller wrote. Their systematic approach to population control could be invaluable in occupied territories. The proposed intelligence cooperation extended far beyond Europe. Soviet agents in South America and Asia would have provided Germany with detailed intelligence on British and American positions. German technical intelligence capabilities would have enhanced Soviet operations worldwide. The combined network would have spanned every continent, with coordinated operations targeting Allied shipping, communications, and industrial facilities. No Allied convoy route would have been safe. No military installation would have remained secret. The joint operational plans reveal the systematic thinking that went into this potential alliance. Operation Orient, developed jointly by German and Soviet planners, would have coordinated drives through the Caucasus and Middle East, meeting at the Suez Canal to cut Britain's lifeline to India. German forces would advance through Turkey and Syria, while Soviet armies pushed through Iran and Iraq. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet would have faced attack from 2 directions, while German and Soviet air forces coordinated strikes on British installations throughout the region. Phase 2 of Orient called for joint German-Soviet operations against British India. German mountain troops, experienced from operations in Norway and the Balkans, would coordinate with Soviet forces advancing through Afghanistan. The plan anticipated reaching Delhi within 4 months of launching the operation. But the most ambitious plan was Operation Polar Bear, a joint assault on Britain itself. German paratroopers and naval infantry would establish beachheads in southern England, while Soviet forces, transported by German vessels, would land in Scotland. Coordinated bomber attacks would target British industrial cities, while submarine operations strangled supply lines. The mathematical calculations were precise and terrifying. German and Soviet planners estimated they could land 400,000 troops on British soil within the first week, supported by 2,000 aircraft and unlimited ammunition supplies. British resistance would have faced an impossible situation, defending against invasion while their empire crumbled in the Middle East and Asia. Perhaps most chilling of all was the early nuclear cooperation that had already begun between German and Soviet scientists. While the American Manhattan Project was still in its planning stages, German physicists were sharing atomic research with their Soviet counterparts. Professor Klaus Fuchs, the German physicist who would later pass atomic secrets to the Soviets as a spy, was already coordinating research in 1940 as part of official cooperation agreements. Soviet uranium reserves, the largest in the world, were being processed using German chemical techniques. Igor Kurchatov, who would later lead the Soviet atomic program, spent 3 months in Berlin during the winter of 1940, studying German nuclear research. His reports to Moscow, declassified only in 2007, show that Soviet scientists understood the military potential of atomic energy earlier than previously known. German theoretical understanding combined with Soviet industrial capacity could achieve nuclear weapons by 1944, Kurchatov wrote. The power to eliminate entire cities is within our reach. The prospect of Hitler and Stalin possessing nuclear weapons 3 years before the United States represents perhaps the most terrifying alternate timeline in human history. The military cooperation was supported by economic integration that would have transformed both nations into an unstoppable industrial powerhouse. Soviet raw materials, iron ore, grain, etc., would fuel German manufacturing capabilities. German technology and organization would multiply Soviet production efficiency. By late 1940, this economic cooperation was already substantial. The Soviet Union was providing Germany with 1,600,000 tons of grain annually, plus 900,000 tons of oil and 1 million tons of iron ore. In return, Germany was delivering advanced machinery, technical expertise, and manufactured goods. But the proposed expansion was breathtaking. German economists calculated that full economic integration could increase German war production by 300%, while providing the Soviet Union with technological capabilities that would advance their economy by decades. The combined German-Soviet economy would have controlled 40% of global industrial capacity, 60% of global oil production, and 30% of global agricultural output. No alliance of remaining nations could have matched such economic power. The proposed unified command structure reveals how seriously both sides took this potential alliance. German and Soviet officers had already begun studying each other's military systems and operational methods. General Georgy Zhukov, who would later capture Berlin, spent 6 weeks in Germany during the summer of 1940, observing Wehrmacht training exercises and studying German tactical innovations. His reports to Stalin praised German organizational efficiency and recommended immediate adoption of German communication and logistics systems. Similarly, General Erich von Manstein, architect of the successful German offensive in France, visited Soviet training facilities and observed Red Army exercises. His assessment was equally positive. Soviet tactical flexibility and strategic patience complement German operational excellence. Combined leadership could achieve unprecedented military effectiveness. The unified command would have placed German and Soviet forces under joint leadership, with German tactical expertise directing Soviet mass and Soviet strategic patience guiding German aggression. The combination would have been unstoppable. All these plans, all this preparation, all this terrifying potential came down to a single decision in November 1940. Stalin had approved the alliance. Soviet military commanders had embraced the cooperation. The economic integration was already underway. Hitler hesitated for 72 hours, and that hesitation saved Western civilization. But the plans didn't disappear. They remained in military archives, a permanent reminder of how close the world came to facing an enemy that no coalition could have defeated. The war machine that never was represents the most dangerous military force ever conceived, and it missed becoming reality by less than 3 days. In Stalin's personal files, discovered after his death, investigators found his final assessment of the potential alliance. With German technology and Soviet resources, global victory was not just possible. By Kaya, it was inevitable. History will judge whether we chose wisely or chose fear. The war machine that never was remains the ultimate testament to how thin the line is between the world that exists and the world that might have been. December 7th, 1941. In our world, this date lives in infamy as Pearl Harbor Day, when Japanese aircraft struck the American naval base in Hawaii, dragging the United States into World War II. But in the nightmare timeline we're exploring, December 7th becomes something far more terrifying. The day Hitler and Stalin announce their military alliance and declare war on the entire democratic world. Picture this scenario unfolding in real time, hour by hour, as the globe itself becomes a battlefield with no sanctuary for freedom anywhere. At dawn, Pacific time, Japanese bombers appear over Pearl Harbor exactly as they did in our timeline. But this time, they're not alone. As American sailors rush to battle stations in Hawaii, radio operators across the Pacific pick up coded transmissions in German and Russian. The attack on Pearl Harbor isn't an isolated strike, it's the opening move in a coordinated global assault. While Japanese planes devastate the Pacific Fleet, German submarines, refueled and resupplied at Soviet bases in Murmansk, launch simultaneous attacks on Allied shipping across the Atlantic. In the space of 6 hours, over 40 merchant vessels disappear beneath the waves, their crews sending final radio messages reporting attacks by submarines flying both Nazi and Soviet flags. But the most shocking blow comes at midnight, Greenwich Mean Time. From airfields across occupied Europe and the Soviet Union, over 2,000 aircraft, AS, German Heinkels and Junkers flying alongside Soviet Ilyushins and Tupolevs, begin the largest bombing raid in history. Their target, London. Winston Churchill, broadcasting from a bunker deep beneath Whitehall, delivers what may be democracy's final speech. The forces of tyranny have united against us. We stand alone against an empire that spans from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. We shall never surrender, but I cannot promise we shall survive. The numbers make victory virtually impossible for the remaining Allies. The combined Axis now controls 400 German divisions plus 600 Soviet divisions, over 1,000 fully equipped units coordinated by the world's most experienced military commanders. Against this force, Britain can field perhaps 40 divisions, while the United States, still mobilizing, can deploy fewer than 20 overseas. The naval balance is equally hopeless. German U-boats, now operating from Soviet Arctic ports, can attack Allied shipping along routes that were previously safe. Soviet submarines, equipped with German torpedo technology, patrol the Pacific alongside Japanese vessels. The Royal Navy, already stretched thin protecting Atlantic convoys, faces submarine attacks from 3 directions. Aircraft production tells the same story. German factories produce 1,200 military aircraft monthly. Soviet plants manufacture 800 more. Japanese production adds another 600. Together, the Axis can build 2,600 military aircraft every month, more than Britain and America combined, even at full wartime production. Most terrifying of all is industrial capacity. The combined German-Soviet economy controls 38% of global steel production, 42% of global oil output, and 61% of global military manufacturing capacity. No alliance of remaining democratic nations can match such overwhelming material advantage. Within weeks of the alliance announcement, the map of Europe undergoes complete transformation. German and Soviet forces, no longer facing each other across a 1,000-mile front, redeploy for coordinated operations against their remaining enemies. Operation Celion, the German invasion of Britain, finally becomes feasible. Without the Eastern Front draining resources, Germany can concentrate its entire military machine against the British Isles. But this time, the assault comes from 2 directions. While German paratroopers and naval infantry establish beachheads in southern England, Soviet naval forces, transported by German vessels and protected by German aircraft, land in Scotland. The Royal Navy faces an impossible choice: defend the English Channel against German invasion fleets, or protect Scottish ports from Soviet assault. They cannot do both effectively. Meanwhile, the RAF fights a losing battle against overwhelming odds. German aircraft based in France and the Low Countries coordinate with Soviet bombers operating from Norway and the Baltic states. British fighter pilots, already exhausted from the Battle of Britain, face continuous attacks from aircraft that can be replaced faster than they can be shot down. Lord Beaverbrook, Churchill's Minister of Aircraft Production, delivers a devastating assessment to the War Cabinet. German and Soviet combined aircraft production exceeds our maximum possible output by 4-1. Even if we shoot down 3 enemy aircraft for every one we lose, we cannot sustain the battle. While Europe burns, the Middle East becomes the stage for perhaps the most strategically significant campaign of this alternate war. Operation Orient, the joint German-Soviet drive toward the Suez Canal, begins simultaneously with the European offensive. German forces advance through Turkey and Syria, while Soviet armies push through Iran and Iraq. The British forces defending the region, already stretched thin between multiple fronts, face coordinated attacks from enemies who share intelligence, logistics, and tactical coordination. The psychological impact on local populations is immediate and devastating. Throughout the Arab world, German and Soviet agents, working in unprecedented cooperation, promote anti-British sentiment while promising independence under Axis protection. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, already sympathetic to Germany, announces support for the new alliance, calling on Muslims worldwide to join the fight against British imperialism. Within 6 weeks, German and Soviet forces meet at Baghdad, cutting Britain's oil lifeline and establishing Axis control over the world's most strategically valuable region. The Suez Canal falls under joint German-Soviet administration, effectively severing Britain's connection to India and Australia. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet, reports a situation of complete strategic collapse. With Axis forces controlling both shores of the Mediterranean and coordinating submarine operations throughout the region, British naval power in the Middle East simply evaporates. The jewel of the British Empire becomes the next target of coordinated Axis expansion. With the Middle East secured and Soviet forces already positioned in Iran and Afghanistan, the invasion of India becomes a matter of straightforward logistics rather than strategic innovation. German mountain troops, veterans of successful operations in Norway and the Balkans, coordinate with Soviet forces experienced in Central Asian warfare. Together, they advance through the traditional invasion routes that Alexander, Genghis Khan, and countless other conquerors had used throughout history. But this invasion differs from all previous attempts. Modern communications, mechanized transport, and air support transform what was once a months-long ordeal into a rapid, coordinated assault. German Stuka dive bombers, flying from captured airfields in Iran, coordinate with Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft to devastate British defensive positions along the northwest frontier. The British Indian Army, trained and equipped for frontier warfare against tribal opponents, proves completely unprepared for coordinated assault by modern mechanized forces. Within 8 weeks of the offensive's beginning, German and Soviet forces reach Delhi, effectively ending British rule over the subcontinent. Mahatma Gandhi, from his prison cell in Pune, issues a statement that captures the transformation. The British Raj is ended, but we have not achieved the independence we sought. We have merely exchanged one form of empire for another, more terrible than any we have known. Number, the Pacific Transformation. In the Pacific, Japanese forces, now supported by their European allies, achieve victories that seemed impossible in our timeline. German submarine technology, shared through the alliance, multiplies Japanese naval capabilities. Soviet intelligence networks in Asia provide detailed information about Allied positions and movements. The attack on Pearl Harbor becomes the prelude to systematic Japanese expansion throughout the Pacific. With German and Soviet forces eliminating British resistance in Europe and Asia, Japanese armies face no coordinated opposition as they advance toward Australia and India. The combined Japanese fleet, reinforced by submarines using German technology and Soviet metallurgy, establishes complete control over Pacific shipping lanes. American forces, still mobilizing for global war, watch helplessly as Japanese, German, and Soviet vessels coordinate operations across the world's largest ocean. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from the damaged facilities at Pearl Harbor, reports a situation of strategic impossibility. The combined fleet, now operating in the Pacific, exceeds American naval capacity by margins that make victory mathematically unachievable. President Franklin Roosevelt faces the most impossible decision in American history. With Britain under invasion, the Soviet Union allied with Germany, and Japan controlling the Pacific, the United States confronts enemies on multiple fronts, with forces insufficient for any single theater. The American military establishment, designed for continental defense with limited overseas capability, proves completely inadequate for global war against coordinated Axis powers. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, presents Roosevelt with calculations that make victory appear impossible even with full mobilization. We face approximately 10 million enemy troops coordinated under unified command, Marshall reports. Our maximum deployment capacity, assuming 18 months of mobilization, approaches 2 million men. The mathematical disparity makes conventional victory unachievable. The isolationist movement, led by Charles Lindbergh and the America First Committee, gains unprecedented support as Americans realize that intervention might mean national destruction rather than democratic salvation. "We cannot save democracy by destroying America," Lindbergh declares to crowds of hundreds of thousands. Roosevelt's final radio address to the American people, delivered on January 20th, 1942, captures the desperation of democracy's last stronghold. "We stand alone against an alliance that controls 2/3 of the world's landmass and population. I cannot promise victory. I can only promise that we shall never surrender the principles that have made America free." Perhaps most horrifying of all is what happens to civilian populations under the expanded Axis alliance. The Holocaust, terrible enough in our timeline, becomes a global extermination program using German efficiency and Soviet scale. Nazi racial ideology, implemented with Soviet organizational methods and industrial capacity, targets populations across 3 continents. The railway systems that transported grain and ore for the alliance also transport human beings to facilities designed for systematic murder. The NKVD and Gestapo, working in unprecedented cooperation, established joint administrative systems for population management throughout occupied territories. German technical expertise in killing methods combines with Soviet experience in mass deportation and labor camps. Heinrich Himmler, writing to Stalin in March 1942, outlines the scope of their coordination. "The elimination of undesirable populations requires systematic cooperation between our organizations. German technical methods, combined with Soviet administrative capacity, can achieve what neither nation could accomplish alone." The results are beyond comprehension. Estimates suggest that the expanded extermination program, operating across Europe, Asia, and potentially other continents, could have eliminated over 20 million people annually by 1943. The alliance accelerates technological development in ways that create new forms of warfare. German rocket technology, supported by Soviet industrial capacity, achieves intercontinental range by late 1942. New York and Washington face bombardment from weapons launched from Europe. Nuclear development, coordinated between German physicists and Soviet scientists with access to unlimited uranium reserves, progresses faster than the American Manhattan Project. By early 1943, the alliance possesses atomic weapons while the United States remains at least 2 years from achieving nuclear capability. Werner von Braun, writing to Hitler in December 1942, describes the strategic implications. "Combined with Soviet production methods, our rocket technology can deliver atomic weapons to any target worldwide. No enemy position is beyond our reach." The psychological impact of nuclear-armed intercontinental missiles transforms global warfare, from military contest to systematic destruction of enemy civilian populations. By the end of 1942, the alternate timeline reaches its logical conclusion. Democratic resistance collapses under coordinated pressure from enemies who control most of the world's resources and population. Britain, under occupation, broadcasts its final transmission. "This is London calling. We are no longer free." The United States, isolated between hostile oceans and facing nuclear attack, negotiates conditional surrender in March 1943. President Roosevelt's final statement captures the end of the democratic era. "We have fought as long as courage and hope could sustain us. The light of freedom is extinguished, but it shall burn again in the hearts of those who remember." The world that would have burned under Hitler-Stalin alliance represents not just military defeat, but the complete transformation of human civilization. In this timeline, authoritarian cooperation achieves what neither dictatorship could accomplish alone, ASAT, the systematic elimination of democratic government and individual freedom from the face of the earth. But here's the detail that makes this alternate history most terrifying. None of it required technological breakthroughs or strategic innovations beyond what existed in 1941. It required only coordination between existing capabilities and the political will to use them without moral constraint. The world that would have burned was always possible. It missed becoming reality by the narrowest of margins, 72 hours of hesitation by a single man whose ego couldn't accept partnership with an equal. The story of how we learned about this near alliance reads like a spy thriller spanning 60 years, complete with secret archives, hidden documents, and revelations that changed everything historians thought they knew about World War II. The truth about Hitler and Stalin's courtship remained buried in classified files until the very empires they built began to crumble. This is the detective story of how researchers pieced together fragments of the most dangerous partnership that almost was, and how each discovery revealed that the nightmare was far closer to reality than anyone had imagined. The trail begins in 1945, in the ruins of Berlin, as Allied investigators sift through the wreckage of the Third Reich. Among the thousands of documents recovered from bombed government buildings, intelligence officers find scattered references to something called Operation Orient and mentions of four-power negotiations that make no sense in the context of the war they've just won. Captain Robert Mattison of U.S. Army Intelligence files a report that will remain classified for 46 years. German documents reference extensive military cooperation planning with Soviet forces for operations in Middle East and India. Details suggest coordination beyond any known bilateral agreements, recommend investigation of captured Soviet materials for corroborating evidence. But the Soviet materials never come. Stalin's regime, now America's Cold War enemy, seals its archives tighter than any vault. The documents that might explain these mysterious German references disappear behind the Iron Curtain, seemingly forever. The few German officers who might have provided answers either die in Soviet captivity or maintain absolute silence about their wartime activities. Gustav Hilger, the German diplomat who interpreted for Stalin during the crucial negotiations, immigrates to the United States and spends 20 years teaching at Georgetown University without ever mentioning what he witnessed in the Kremlin. The first breakthrough comes from an unexpected source. In 1968, East German authorities, seeking to demonstrate their anti-fascist credentials, open limited access to captured Nazi documents. Western historians, allowed into archives for the first time since the war, make discoveries that challenge everything they thought they understood. Professor Fritz Stern of Columbia University finds references to joint German-Soviet planning committees that operated throughout 1940. The documents describe military cooperation on a scale that seems impossible given the official narrative of perpetual Nazi-Soviet hostility. Either these documents are elaborate forgeries, Stern writes in his classified report to the State Department, or the relationship between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia was fundamentally different from what we've assumed. The State Department files Stern's report without action. The Cold War narrative requires that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia be portrayed as natural enemies. Evidence suggesting otherwise threatens the ideological foundation of American foreign policy, but the documents keep surfacing. In 1973, British historian Alan Bullock gains access to captured German Foreign Ministry files and discovers correspondence between Ribbentrop and Molotov that extends far beyond the public non-aggression pact. The letters, marked most secret and coded in diplomatic cipher, reveal ongoing negotiations about territorial divisions, military cooperation, and economic integration that continued right up until Operation Barbarossa. The real revolution in understanding begins on December 26, 1991, when the Soviet Union officially ceases to exist. Suddenly, archives that have been sealed for 50 years begin opening to researchers. What they find inside transforms the entire historical narrative of World War II. Gabriel Gorodetsky, a historian at Tel Aviv University, becomes one of the first Western researchers granted access to Soviet diplomatic archives. What he discovers in the basement of the Foreign Ministry building shocks him. Complete files of Stalin's correspondence with German officials throughout 1940 and 1941. I found Stalin's personal copies of every message exchanged with Berlin, Gorodetsky later recalls. Not just the official diplomatic notes, but his private instructions to Molotov, his personal assessments of German proposals, even his handwritten notes on the margins of German documents. The most stunning discovery is Stalin's copy of Hitler's proposal for a four-power alliance, dated November 10, 1940. Stalin's handwritten response, preserved in the same file, accepts the proposal in principle and suggests immediate military cooperation in the Middle East. But Gorodetsky finds something even more significant: Stalin's personal analysis of why the alliance would benefit Soviet interests. Written in his distinctive handwriting, the document outlines a strategic vision that prioritizes Soviet expansion over ideological consistency. Bolshevik principles must serve Russian interests, Stalin writes, not constrain them. If partnership with fascist Germany advances Soviet power, then partnership becomes a revolutionary duty. Meanwhile, in Germany, reunification opens East German archives that contain captured Wehrmacht documents from the final days of the war. American historian Gerhard Weinberg spends 5 years cataloguing these materials and makes discoveries that complement Gorodetsky's Soviet findings. The German documents reveal the existence of Joint Planning Commission 7, a secret military committee that operated from September 1940 through May 1941. The commission included senior officers from both the Wehrmacht and Red Army, working on detailed plans for coordinated operations against British positions worldwide. General Alfred Jodel's private papers, discovered in 1995, contain his personal assessment of Soviet military capabilities and strategic thinking. Jodl concludes that Soviet forces could provide exactly what German strategy required: massive manpower and unlimited raw materials, guided by German tactical expertise. The Russians possess everything we lack, Jodl writes in a memorandum to Hitler dated January 15, 1941. Combined with our advantages in technology and organization, German-Soviet cooperation could achieve global dominance within 2 years. But the most significant German discovery comes from an unexpected source. In 1998, construction workers renovating the Chancellery building in Berlin discover a hidden vault containing Hitler's personal files from the final months before Operation Barbarossa. Among these documents is Hitler's own analysis of Stalin's alliance proposal, complete with maps showing proposed spheres of influence and detailed military cooperation plans. Hitler's handwritten notes reveal the depth of his temptation to accept Stalin's terms. "The Georgian offers everything we need," Hitler writes on the margin of Stalin's proposal. "But partnership with such a man requires sharing power. This I cannot do." The most shocking revelations come from intelligence archives that remained classified long after the war ended. In 2001, the CIA declassifies wartime documents that reveal extensive American knowledge of German-Soviet cooperation during the critical period of 1940 to 1941. OSS reports from Switzerland describe regular meetings between German and Soviet intelligence officials throughout 1940. American agents observed joint Gestapo-NKVD operations in Poland and reported coordination that extended far beyond what public agreements suggested. Wild Bill Donovan, head of the OSS, wrote a memorandum to President Roosevelt in December 1940 that contained a startling assessment. German and Soviet intelligence services are operating as effective allies despite official ideological hostility. This cooperation suggests strategic coordination at highest levels of both governments. Roosevelt's response, preserved in his personal files, shows that American leadership understood the implications. If Stalin joins the Axis, democratic civilization faces extinction. We must be prepared for that possibility. The most comprehensive revelations emerge after 2000, when Russian President Vladimir Putin authorizes limited access to former KGB archives as part of historical reconciliation efforts. What researchers find there completes the picture of just how close the alliance came to reality. Russian historian Oleg Rychevsky discovers the complete files of the Soviet intelligence services' cooperation with German counterparts. The documents reveal that by late 1940, NKVD and Gestapo were sharing information about émigré organizations, coordinating operations against Polish resistance, and planning joint activities in occupied territories. But Rychevsky's most important discovery is the actual draft treaty that would have formalized the German-Soviet alliance. The document, typed on official Kremlin stationery and bearing Stalin's personal seal, outlines the specific terms of military, economic, and political cooperation. Article 12 of the draft treaty contains the most chilling provision: coordinated population management policies in occupied territories. The language is bureaucratic, but the meaning is clear: joint German-Soviet administration of systematic extermination programs. The scale of what they planned was beyond anything either regime could have achieved independently, Reshevsky later writes. German efficiency combined with Soviet industrial capacity could have eliminated entire populations with assembly line precision. As historians piece together documents from German, Soviet, American, and British archives, a clear pattern emerges. The Hitler-Stalin alliance wasn't a theoretical possibility, it was a detailed plan that came within days of implementation. The cooperation already existed at multiple levels: military training, intelligence sharing, economic integration, and technological exchange. All that remained was formalizing the partnership through the treaty that Stalin had already approved and Hitler had spent 72 hours considering. Professor Norman Davies of Oxford University, synthesizing decades of archival research, reaches a stunning conclusion. The Hitler-Stalin alliance was the most probable outcome of the strategic situation in late 1940. What requires explanation is not why they considered alliance, but why they chose war instead. The last pieces of the puzzle emerge from the most unlikely sources. In 2007, construction workers renovating Stalin's former dacha outside Moscow discover a hidden room containing his personal papers from the war period. Among these documents is Stalin's private diary from November 1940, written during the crucial negotiations with Germany. The entries reveal Stalin's thinking in his own words, as he considered partnership with Hitler. November 14th. The German proposal exceeds even my expectations. They offer not just territory, but genuine partnership in reshaping the world. This is what socialism requires: power sufficient to remake civilization itself. November 16th. Hitler hesitates because he fears sharing power with an equal. His psychology may doom both our revolutions. Ideology means nothing without the strength to impose it. November 19th. The Führer has chosen war over wisdom. He will regret this decision when German soldiers freeze in Russian snow, but the moment for partnership has passed. The final entry, dated June 21st, 1941, m. The night before Operation Barbarossa began, Stalin's most revealing assessment. Hitler has chosen to destroy himself rather than share the world. His pride will be the salvation of his enemies and the doom of his people. Together, these discoveries from multiple archives create a complete picture of the most dangerous diplomatic negotiation in human history. The evidence reveals that German-Soviet alliance wasn't a theoretical possibility debated by academics, CTMA. It was a detailed plan, developed by military professionals, approved by political leaders, and stopped only by Hitler's personal psychology. The implications transform our understanding of World War II, the Cold War, and the nature of ideological conflict itself. The war we remember as a struggle between good and evil was actually a conflict shaped by chance, personality, and the narrowest of historical margins. If Hitler had signed Stalin's treaty, concludes historian Richard Overy, the 20th century would have unfolded completely differently. Democracy might not have survived. The war we remember as the Good War might never have been fought at all. But even with all these revelations, mysteries remain. Some documents are still classified. Some participants took their secrets to the grave. Some evidence may have been deliberately destroyed. The most intriguing mystery involves the role of British intelligence in Hitler's decision to reject Stalin's alliance proposal. Recently declassified MI6 files suggest that British agents may have influenced German decision-making through carefully planted disinformation about Soviet military capabilities. If true, this would mean that British intelligence, perhaps without fully understanding the consequences, may have prevented the most dangerous alliance in human history through sophisticated psychological manipulation of Hitler's ego and paranoia. The detective story continues, with new revelations emerging as archives open and new historians ask different questions about the evidence. But enough has been discovered to know with certainty that the world came far closer to catastrophe than anyone imagined. The alliance that would have doomed civilization missed becoming reality by the smallest of margins, AC, and the evidence of how close it came continues to emerge from the shadows of history, piece by carefully hidden piece. The alliance that never was still shapes our world in ways that will astonish you. Every NATO strategy meeting, every intelligence briefing, every diplomatic calculation in the modern era operates under the shadow of what almost happened in November 1940. The lesson learned from studying Hitler and Stalin's near partnership has become the fundamental assumption underlying every major alliance decision since 1945. That lesson? Enemies can become allies overnight when it serves their interests, and ideological differences mean nothing when power is at stake. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed in 1949, wasn't just a response to Soviet aggression. When say yes, it was a direct reaction to the revelation that authoritarian powers could coordinate against democratic nations far more effectively than anyone had imagined. General Dwight Eisenhower, NATO's first supreme Allied commander, had access to classified intelligence about the extent of German-Soviet cooperation during the early war years. His strategic planning reflected hard-learned lessons about the speed with which hostile alliances could form. The Nazi-Soviet cooperation revealed democracy's greatest vulnerability, Eisenhower wrote in his classified memoir, published only in 2005. Democratic nations debate and deliberate. Dictatorships simply decide. An alliance between Stalin and Hitler would have overwhelmed any response we could have mounted. NATO's founding principle, that an attack on one member constitutes an attack on all, directly addresses the mathematical impossibility that democratic nations faced when considering the potential Hitler-Stalin alliance. No single democracy could resist the combined power of coordinated authoritarian regimes. Only permanent alliance could provide sufficient deterrent strength. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which commits all members to collective defense, was specifically designed to prevent authoritarian powers from achieving the kind of strategic advantage that German-Soviet cooperation would have provided. The mathematical calculations remain the same. Dictatorships working together can overwhelm individual democracies, but not an integrated democratic alliance. Modern intelligence agencies structure their entire mission around monitoring for signs of authoritarian cooperation because they understand how quickly such partnerships can transform global power balances. The CIA, formed in 1947, made tracking potential authoritarian alliances its highest priority. Allen Dulles, the CIA's first civilian director, had served as OSS station chief in Switzerland during the war and personally observed German-Soviet intelligence cooperation. His experience shaped American intelligence doctrine for decades. The cooperation between the Gestapo and NKVD demonstrated that ideological enemies could become operational allies within months, Dulles wrote in his operational guidelines for CIA analysis. Our fundamental mission is ensuring that such cooperation never again threatens democratic civilization. The National Security Agency, established in 1952, focused its signals intelligence capabilities on detecting communications between potential authoritarian partners. The assumption underlying NSA operations was that authoritarian regimes would always seek alliance when confronting democratic opposition. Even today, intelligence agencies specifically monitor for signs of coordinated authoritarian cooperation. The patterns identified in German-Soviet collaboration, IS, shared technology, coordinated operations, integrated planning, remain the template for recognizing emerging threats to democratic nations. The Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe after World War II, was directly influenced by analysis of what would have happened if Hitler and Stalin had combined their economic resources. American planners understood that authoritarian economic cooperation could outproduce democratic competition unless democratic nations coordinated their own economic policies. George Marshall himself, in classified testimony to Congress in 1947, explained the strategic thinking. German-Soviet economic integration would have controlled over 40% of global industrial capacity. democratic nations must achieve similar integration or face economic subordination to authoritarian alliances. The European Economic Community, formed in 1957, and its evolution into the European Union, represents the democratic response to the economic coordination that Hitler and Stalin almost achieved. The lesson was clear. Authoritarian regimes could integrate their economies rapidly through central command, while democratic nations required institutional frameworks to achieve similar coordination. Number, the containment doctrine. George Kennan's containment strategy, which guided American foreign policy throughout the Cold War, was fundamentally shaped by understanding how close Hitler and Stalin came to alliance. Kennan had served in the American embassy in Moscow during the crucial negotiations of 1940 and witnessed Soviet strategic thinking firsthand. His famous Long Telegram of 1946 contains direct references to the lessons learned from studying Nazi-Soviet cooperation. Soviet leaders demonstrated their willingness to ally with any regime that advances their strategic interests, regardless of ideological differences. The implications for American policy are profound. We cannot assume that ideological opposition will prevent Soviet cooperation with other authoritarian powers. Containment wasn't just about preventing Soviet expansion, FUSC. It was about preventing Soviet alliance with other authoritarian regimes that could recreate the strategic nightmare that Hitler and Stalin almost achieved. The domino theory, which drove American involvement in conflicts from Korea to Vietnam, reflected deep understanding that authoritarian regimes could coordinate more effectively than democratic alliances. Every regional conflict became a test of whether democratic or authoritarian coordination would prove more effective. The patterns identified in German-Soviet cooperation appear throughout contemporary international relations, confirming that the lessons learned from studying the Hitler-Stalin near alliance remain relevant today. The current partnership between certain authoritarian regimes mirrors the pragmatic calculations that nearly brought Hitler and Stalin together. Economic cooperation, military coordination, and shared opposition to democratic influence create bonds that transcend ideological differences. Intelligence analysts specifically look for the warning signs identified in German-Soviet cooperation: technology sharing, coordinated diplomatic positions, joint military exercises, and economic integration that increases combined strategic capabilities. The Belt and Road Initiative represents exactly the kind of economic integration that German-Soviet planners envisioned, using economic cooperation to create strategic dependencies that can be leveraged for political advantage. The scale and ambition mirror the economic coordination that Hitler and Stalin planned for their global alliance. Perhaps most chilling is how nuclear weapons change the implications of authoritarian cooperation. The atomic collaboration that began between German and Soviet scientists in 1940 provides the template for understanding how authoritarian regimes can coordinate nuclear development. Modern intelligence agencies monitor nuclear cooperation with the understanding that authoritarian regimes sharing nuclear technology could achieve strategic advantages that individual nations cannot. The lesson from German-Soviet atomic cooperation is that authoritarian regimes will share their most sensitive technologies when strategic benefits justify the risks. The nuclear cooperation agreements between certain authoritarian regimes today echo the atomic collaboration that Hitler and Stalin began in 1940. The same calculations apply. Shared nuclear technology multiplies the strategic capabilities of both partners, while creating combined threats that democratic nations struggle to address. The competition that drove America to the moon had its origins in understanding how German-Soviet rocket cooperation could have threatened American security. When Soviet scientists captured German rocket technology at the end of World War II, American planners realized they were competing against the combined capabilities that Hitler and Stalin had planned to develop together. Wernher von Braun, who led American rocket development after the war, explicitly warned that Soviet acquisition of German rocket technology created the strategic threat that German-Soviet cooperation would have achieved during the war. The Soviets now possess the rocket technology that we developed for the Wehrmacht, von Braun wrote in 1947. Combined with their industrial capacity and strategic patience, they can achieve what German-Soviet cooperation would have accomplished, re-80, the ability to strike any target on Earth. The Apollo program represented America's response to this combined threat, demonstrating that democratic nations could achieve technological superiority through sustained investment and international cooperation. Modern economic competition between democratic and authoritarian systems reflects the lessons learned from studying German-Soviet economic integration plans. The Belt and Road Initiative, state-directed technology development, and coordinated economic policies among authoritarian regimes all echo the economic cooperation that Hitler and Stalin designed. Democratic Responses, SIM, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, coordinated sanctions, technology sharing agreements, ISF, represent attempts to achieve the economic coordination that authoritarian regimes can accomplish through central command. The fundamental challenge remains the same. Authoritarian regimes can integrate their economies rapidly through government direction, while democratic nations require complex negotiations and institutional frameworks to achieve similar coordination. Military planners specifically study the Hitler-Stalin cooperation model when analyzing potential conflicts involving coordinated authoritarian action. The invasion scenarios that concern defense planners today mirror the coordinated operations that German and Soviet forces would have launched against British positions worldwide. The mathematical challenges remain identical. Democratic nations must coordinate response to threats that authoritarian regimes can launch through unified command. The timing, coordination, and resource allocation that concern modern military planners directly parallel the operational challenges that German-Soviet cooperation would have created. Modern intelligence cooperation among democratic nations directly reflects lessons learned from studying Gestapo-NKVD collaboration. The Five Eyes intelligence, alliance, NATO intelligence sharing, and coordinated surveillance programs all represent attempts to match the intelligence coordination that authoritarian regimes can achieve through centralized command. The specific techniques that concern modern intelligence analysts, AS, coordinated disinformation, shared surveillance technology, integrated cyber operations, OMEA, mirror exactly the cooperation that German and Soviet intelligence services achieved during their brief partnership. Perhaps most importantly, understanding the Hitler-Stalin near alliance reveals the psychological patterns that drive authoritarian cooperation. Modern psychological profiling of authoritarian leaders specifically looks for the traits that made Hitler and Stalin potential partners. Paranoia about democratic encirclement, grandiose ambitions that require external resources, and willingness to subordinate ideology to strategic advantage. The psychological assessments that intelligence agencies develop for contemporary authoritarian leaders use the Hitler-Stalin relationship as the template for understanding how personal psychology influences strategic calculation. The alliance that never was continues to haunt modern strategic planning because it revealed democracy's fundamental vulnerability. Democratic nations debate while dictatorships decide. The speed with which Hitler and Stalin moved from ideological enemies to potential partners demonstrates that authoritarian cooperation can emerge faster than democratic response. Every NATO summit, every intelligence estimate, every strategic assessment operates under the shadow of November 1940, when two men came within 72 hours of forming an alliance that would have doomed democratic civilization. The lesson remains as relevant today as it was 80 years ago. Freedom survives only through vigilance, alliance, and the understanding that today's enemies can become tomorrow's partners faster than democracy can respond. The shadows of the past continue to shape the present because the fundamental calculations haven't changed. Power still trumps ideology. Strategic advantage still overcomes political differences. And democratic nations still require permanent alliance to survive in a world where authoritarian regimes can coordinate overnight. The Hitler-Stalin alliance that never was remains the ultimate reminder that the world we know exists only because of the narrowest of historical margins, maybe CT, and that those margins could disappear again with terrifying speed. The story of history's most terrifying alliance that never happened reveals the most profound truth about power. ideology matters far less than survival and expansion. Stalin, the supposed champion of international communism, was ready to abandon everything for partnership with fascism. Hitler, the supposed defender of Western civilization against Bolshevism, calculated that alliance might serve German interests better than war. It's a window into how power actually works, how quickly today's enemies can become tomorrow's allies, and why no alliance or enmity should ever be considered permanent. When we strip away the propaganda and examine what actually drove these two men toward potential partnership, we discover psychological patterns that transcend ideology and historical period. Both Hitler and Stalin shared fundamental characteristics that made alliance not just possible, but logical. Paranoia dominated both their worldviews. Hitler saw Germany surrounded by enemies plotting its destruction. Stalin believed the Soviet Union faced constant threat from capitalist encirclement. This shared paranoia created common ground that ideology alone could never provide. Both leaders understood that survival required eliminating external threats, regardless of the methods required. Grandiosity shaped their strategic thinking. Neither man was content with regional dominance or incremental expansion. Both envisioned reshaping the entire global order according to their personal vision. This grandiose ambition made cooperation attractive because neither could achieve world domination independently. Most importantly, both demonstrated absolute willingness to subordinate ideology to practical advantage. Stalin had already purged millions of Communist Party members who threatened his personal power. Hitler had eliminated SA leaders who had helped bring him to power when they became inconvenient. For leaders who would murder their own supporters for strategic advantage, ideological flexibility was a minor consideration. The psychological profile that emerged from studying their near alliance became the template for understanding authoritarian behavior. Paranoid assessment of external threats, grandiose ambitions requiring external resources, and complete willingness to abandon principles for strategic advantage. The calculations that nearly brought Hitler and Stalin together reveal how power actually operates at the highest levels of international relations. Both leaders approached the alliance question through mathematical analysis rather than ideological conviction. German planners calculated that Soviet raw materials could fuel German industrial expansion indefinitely. Soviet planners determined that German technology could advance Soviet capabilities by decades. Combined, their military forces would outnumber any possible opposition by margins that made defeat mathematically impossible. The economic mathematics were equally compelling. German-Soviet cooperation would control 40% of global industrial capacity, 60% of global oil production, and 30% of global agricultural output. No alliance of remaining nations could match such overwhelming material advantage. Most tellingly, both sides calculated that alliance would be more efficient than conquest. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union ultimately required over 3 million troops and consumed resources that could have been used for global expansion. Stalin's resistance required mobilizing over 30 million people and devastated Soviet industrial capacity for years. Partnership would have achieved the same strategic goals: ASA, German access to Soviet resources, Soviet access to German technology, without the massive costs of military conflict. The mathematical logic was inescapable. Cooperation was more efficient than conquest. Perhaps the most important lesson from studying this near alliance is how little ideology actually mattered when strategic interests aligned. Both Hitler and Stalin had spent years convincing their populations that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia represented incompatible worldviews locked in eternal struggle. But when strategic advantage required cooperation, ideological differences evaporated almost instantly. Stalin privately dismissed communist opposition to fascism as bourgeois sentimentality that ignored strategic realities. Hitler argued that temporary alliance with Bolsheviks served long-term German interests better than immediate confrontation. The speed with which both leaders abandoned ideological constraints reveals ideology's true function in authoritarian systems. It's a tool for controlling domestic populations, not a genuine guide for strategic decision-making. When ideology conflicts with strategic advantage, authoritarian leaders choose advantage every time. This pattern appears throughout history. Stalin later allied with capitalist Britain and America when German invasion threatened Soviet survival. Hitler briefly considered alliance with the Soviet Union again in 1944 when facing inevitable defeat. Mao collaborated with the United States against the Soviet Union when Chinese interests required American partnership. Ideology provides the narrative that justifies power, but it never constrains power when survival or expansion is at stake. One of the most unsettling aspects of the Hitler-Stalin negotiations is how quickly mortal enemies could become operational allies. The process took less than 4 months from initial contact to detailed military coordination plans. August 1939. Non-Aggression Pact signed September 1939. Coordinated invasion of Poland. October 1939. Economic Cooperation Agreements November 1939. Military technology sharing begins December 1939. Joint intelligence operations January 1940. Coordinated diplomatic positions February 1940. Shared strategic planning March 1940. Integrated military exercises. By spring 1940, German and Soviet forces were training together, sharing intelligence, and coordinating operations across multiple continents. The transformation from ideological enemies to practical allies required less time than most democratic nations need to negotiate trade agreements. This speed of transformation has profound implications for understanding modern international relations. Alliance patterns that seem permanent can shift dramatically within months when strategic calculations change. Enemies can become partners faster than democratic institutions can respond. Studying the psychological dynamics between Hitler and Stalin reveals universal patterns in how authoritarian leaders assess potential partnerships. Despite their vastly different backgrounds and ideologies, both men applied identical criteria when evaluating the alliance proposal: strategic complementarity. Each side possessed capabilities the other lacked. Resource optimization. Cooperation would multiply both sides' effective power. Risk mitigation. Alliance would eliminate the threat each posed to the other expansion opportunities. Partnership would enable achievements impossible independently. These calculations transcend historical period, national culture, and ideological framework. They represent the fundamental mathematics that drive authoritarian decision-making in any era. Contemporary authoritarian leaders apply the same criteria when evaluating potential partnerships: economic complementarity, military coordination, shared opposition to democratic influence, and mutual expansion opportunities create bonds that override ideological differences. The human psychology that made Hitler-Stalin alliance possible doesn't disappear with historical change. The same paranoia, grandiosity, and ruthless pragmatism that nearly brought them together continue to shape authoritarian behavior today. The Hitler-Stalin near alliance exposes democracy's structural disadvantage when confronting coordinated authoritarian threats. Democratic decision-making requires debate, consensus building, and institutional approval, HO, processes that take months or years to complete. Authoritarian decision-making requires only the calculation and consent of individual leaders, processes that can be completed in hours or days. Hitler and Stalin negotiated their potential alliance faster than the British Parliament could debate responses to German aggression. This speed differential creates persistent vulnerability for democratic nations. By the time democratic institutions recognize and respond to emerging authoritarian cooperation, the coordination may already be operationally effective. Modern democratic alliances attempt to address this disadvantage through permanent institutional frameworks that enable rapid response to emerging threats. NATO, intelligence sharing agreements, and economic coordination mechanisms all represent attempts to match the speed advantage that authoritarian cooperation naturally provides. But the fundamental asymmetry remains. Authoritarian regimes can coordinate overnight, while democratic alliances require sustained institutional cooperation to achieve similar effectiveness. The Hitler-Stalin case study reveals how technology sharing between authoritarian regimes can create strategic advantages that individual nations cannot achieve. German rocket technology, combined with Soviet industrial capacity, would have produced weapons capabilities beyond what either nation could develop independently. This pattern has profound implications for modern strategic planning. Authoritarian regimes sharing artificial intelligence, quantum computing, space technology, or biotechnology can achieve combined capabilities that exceed what democratic nations can produce through individual research programs. The nuclear cooperation that began between German and Soviet scientists in 1940 provides the template for understanding how authoritarian technology sharing amplifies individual capabilities. When authoritarian regimes coordinate their most advanced research, they can achieve breakthrough capabilities faster than democratic competition can respond. Modern technology transfer between certain authoritarian regimes follows exactly the patterns established in German-Soviet cooperation. Shared research facilities, coordinated development programs, and integrated manufacturing capabilities that multiply individual national advantages. Perhaps most importantly, the Hitler-Stalin case reveals how authoritarian cooperation creates network effects that are greater than the sum of individual capabilities. German organizational efficiency organizing Soviet spy networks created intelligence capabilities that neither nation possessed independently. Modern authoritarian cooperation follows identical patterns: shared intelligence networks, coordinated disinformation campaigns, and integrated cyber operations create combined capabilities that exceed what individual regimes can achieve through independent action. The mathematical principle remains constant. Authoritarian cooperation multiplies individual capabilities through systematic coordination that democratic nations struggle to match through voluntary cooperation. The alliance that never was teaches us that no political arrangement should be considered permanent. The speed with which Hitler and Stalin moved from ideological enemies to potential partners demonstrates that today's strategic assumptions can become tomorrow's historical footnotes. Every alliance, every enmity, every strategic calculation operates within this fundamental uncertainty. The world order that seems stable today exists only because certain potential partnerships haven't yet served the interests of the parties involved. Understanding this impermanence doesn't create pessimism, $PC. It creates realistic assessment of how international relations actually function. Democratic nations survive through vigilance, alliance, and institutional frameworks that can respond rapidly to changing strategic calculations. The psychological profiles that made Hitler-Stalin alliance possible — paranoia, grandiosity, ruthless pragmatism — didn't die with their regimes. They live on in every authoritarian leader who faces the choice between ideology and advantage. Contemporary intelligence analysts specifically look for these psychological markers when assessing potential authoritarian cooperation. The patterns identified in German-Soviet negotiations remain the template for recognizing emerging threats to democratic civilization. The warning signs are universal: shared paranoia about democratic encirclement, grandiose ambitions requiring external resources, willingness to subordinate ideology to strategic advantage, and calculation that cooperation serves interests better than competition. Understanding how close Hitler and Stalin came to alliance reveals the choices that every generation faces. The world order that protects democratic values exists only through active choice and sustained effort. It cannot be maintained through wishful thinking or historical assumption. The alliance that would have doomed civilization missed becoming reality by 72 hours of hesitation by a faced, single man whose ego couldn't accept partnership with an equal. This narrow margin demonstrates how fragile the foundations of freedom actually are, but it also reveals the power of individual decision-making in shaping historical outcomes. Hitler's psychological inability to share power saved democratic civilization from extinction. One man's personal limitations prevented the nightmare scenario that rational strategic calculation suggested was inevitable. The story of history's most terrifying alliance that never happened ultimately reveals both the fragility and the resilience of human freedom. Democratic civilization can disappear within months if authoritarian powers coordinate effectively. But it can also survive against overwhelming odds if democratic nations maintain vigilance and alliance. The calculations that nearly brought Hitler and Stalin together haven't disappeared. They remain embedded in the mathematical realities of international relations, waiting for leaders with sufficient paranoia, grandiosity, and pragmatism to apply them again. The psychological profiles that made their partnership possible continue to emerge in every generation. The strategic logic that drove their cooperation remains valid in any era where authoritarian regimes seek expansion and democratic nations resist coordination. The eternal warning from November 1940 is that freedom survives only through eternal vigilance, sustained alliance, and deep understanding that today's enemies can become tomorrow's partners faster than democracy can respond. The alliance that never was reminds us that the world we know exists only because of the narrowest of historical margins, as CA, and that those margins must be actively defended by every generation that values freedom over power, cooperation over conquest, and human dignity over strategic advantage. In the end, the choice remains as stark today as it was 80 years ago. Vigilance or vulnerability, alliance or isolation, active defense of democratic values, or passive hope that authoritarian calculation will constrain itself. The shadow of November 1940 reminds us that hope alone is never enough.